good reasons scale and bad reasons don't.
Isn't that the opposite of the truth?
No,
If you're calling these stories that give prescriptions for how to behave bad ideas, the point is those stories propagate very easily. So if we want to talk about the gun and whether it is loaded, the idea that the gun is definitely loaded, that scales really easily, right? You can pass that along in one sentence.
And the consequences of being wrong about a loaded gun also scale, right? So,
no.
Well,
if you want to talk to people about very small possibilities of very dire things happening, they trip over it. It's a hard thing to get. It's almost impossible for children to get it. So the point is, the one thing does scale, a story that says, yeah, every gun is loaded. It's a false story, but that one definitely scales.
Yeah.
The statistical reality of guns and the fact that they may indeed be unloaded, but you don't want to play around with the remote possibility that one day you'll get it wrong, right? That doesn't scale because it requires you to have experience with stuff that is not common.
Right. Well, so there are two things here. One, you bring up an ancillary but very important point, which is that moral progress here is often the result of moving from our story-driven, protagonist-driven intuitions to something far more quantified, right? So I mean, this is a classic, moral study done by Paul Slovic, who I'm sure you are aware of, where you tell people about one needy little girl in Africa, and you give her a name and show her picture, and what you elicit is the maximum altruistic, compassionate response from subjects. You go to another group of subjects, you tell them about the same little girl, give her the same name, but also tell them about her needy little brother, right, who has the same need, and their response diminishes, right? Just the addition of a single person diminishes the response, and this is a moral fallacy that we're all living out every day, because if you care about this one little girl, you should care at least as much about the fate of her and her brother. And when you add statistics to it...
No, you shouldn't, because you'll exhaust yourself.
No, you shouldn't. This is a bug, not a feature.
Man, you'll exhaust yourself in the attempt.
No, because we need...
What, are you going to care for 100 people with the same intensity that you care for one?
This is what this software flaw gets us. It gets us people who will watch for hours a day with effortless and tear-stained compassion the saga of the little girl who fell down the well, but who will blithely turn the channel when they're hearing about a genocide that is raging and hundreds of thousands have already died.
Sam, listen, guys.
This is something we have to correct for this. No, I'm not talking about person. No, but you're misunderstanding me to great effect here. That I'm not saying that you should personally be overwhelmed by the death toll every day. I'm not saying that it's functional for you and I to each personally get up each morning and just drink deep of the full horror of all the bad luck that is spread.
No, maybe it is, but maybe we can't handle it.
But as societies, we need, when you're talking about how we spend our money, how we apportion foreign aid, the kinds of wars we fight or don't fight, the kinds of then we have to correct for what is in fact a moral illusion, which is we know that if we tell we tell one compelling story about a little girl, right, we could go to war over that, right, whereas we won't be motivated by a genocide. That's the kind of thing that moves whole societies now. And if you add to it the bogus religious sanctities, if we burned a Quran on this stage tonight, the rest of our lives would be spent in hiding, right? Because of how motivated people would be to address that pseudo problem, right? That's the world we're living in, and civilization, insofar as we have a purchase on it, is a matter of correcting for those errors. And
but
religion, for the most part, not across the board, but for the most part, is standing in the way of those course corrections.
Well, okay, there is a tremendous amount to unpack in that. I mean, and like in some sense a surprising amount. It's like, well, we're wired to feel intense empathy for individuals who are close to us, and we can be told stories in a manner that makes that system manifest itself. And everyone and their dog thinks that that's a wonderful thing, and we call that empathy, right? And empathy has a narrow domain of utility, as it turns out, because maybe if you were all who you should be, you'd be weeping constantly for the catastrophic fate of sentient beings on the earth, but you can't handle it, you know what I mean? It's that you can barely handle your own suffering, and maybe you can handle a bit of the suffering of your family, and more power to you if you could rectify that, and if you were better human beings, maybe you could expand that outwards. But the fact that our empathy doesn't scale up to the level of genocide with the same intensity that we treat instances of individual suffering isn't an indication that we're irrational. It's just an indication that we're limited.
Well,
now,
that's not true.
I think this is an indication of exactly the problem of our evolved structures not matching the present. Because the point is...
Well, they do match because we take care of our families.
No, but they don't match because if you encountered the starving girl, that's some sort of it's a crude measure of suffering in your local environment. Were you in the past? Now that you can encounter this girl on the television, it's not clear what it should mean to you.
Right.
Right? You can't calibrate
it might
how
mean
many...
get your act together.
Right, and so the point is, your indifference to a genocide, which is an abstraction, right, is altered should you see pictures of the bodies, for example. You shouldn't actually feel differently about the genocide in the abstract case versus the case that you're looking at the bodies. And the fact that we have access to photorealistic representations of these things is new.
But it's worse than that. This is why it's actually irrational, because I can show you the case where you care at level 10 about the little girl named Leela, and you care at level 8 about the little girl named Leela and her brother named Janti, right? And you care at level 4 if I've added a few more kids, but the little girl named Leela, who you ostensibly care about, is there in each one of these, right? So it is
but your
irrational.
resources are diminished.
No, but like
you have multiplication of the suffering.
You have $10 to give away every month to help struggling humanity, and you tell me you'll give 10 to Leela this month, and then I catch you in another moment, and I say, well, you know, it's Leela and her brother, so it's like if you only can give 10. I understand, but you know, the problem is actually worse than I suspected. And you say, well, actually, I'm just going to give 8, right? It's not coherent with how much you cared about Leela in the first place.
We do know quite well that the heuristics that we use to orient ourselves in the world can be placed into frameworks where they produce contradictory outcomes. But that doesn't mean that the heuristics themselves are deeply flawed. It's a problem with the work of people like Kahneman and Tversky.
Yeah,
is they take perfectly valid heuristics
for them. We need to correct for them because they're producing a reliable result that we recognize.
Yeah, but no, you can put them in a
non-functional.
situation where they produce a counterproductive response, but that doesn't mean that generally speaking in most situations they don't produce a useful outcome, because the question is, why in the hell would have they evolved if they didn't produce a useful outcome most of the time?
They evolved to live with 150 people with whom we're related and to be terrified of the people in the next valley who may want to kill and eat us.
Yes,
right?
and that's
our ancient circumstance,
right.
Which doesn't map onto a common humanity of 7 billion people trying to figure out how to get to Mars without killing each other.
Well, it does map onto it sometimes, unfortunately, because there are many times when we still face the same kind of threats.
It maps onto. This is the hierarchy that we're trying to climb
Sam.
here.
You wouldn't be concerned about the fundamentalist terror of Islam if you weren't driven by those essentially tribal considerations.
No,
and I'm not suggesting that it's wrong.
It doesn't require. If a mere identification with humanity, it can ground not wanting to be murdered by people who are identified with a subset of humanity, right? Like I don't need to be part of a smaller tribe to care that people will murder me over burning a Quran, right? It's clearly counterproductive that we live in a society where some objects are held with such totemic attachment for irrational reasons by many, many millions of people, where that you should be sympathetic with this. Our free speech is actually canceled on this point, right? I mean,
yes.
We literally can't produce cartoons.
Look,
there are scholarly works about the cartoon crisis that don't show the cartoons.
We have no argument whatsoever between us about the lack of utility of certain
You don't have to be identified
presuppositions.
as a Christian or a Jew to push back against that. You just have to be a human being that sees the dysfunction of a smaller kind of provincialism.
Well, the thing that I'm struggling with is that I still can't understand in what your ethos is grounded. Because you claim like a transcendental rationalism, but you won't identify the structures that produce it. It's a black box. And when I try to push you on the absolute nature of your ethical claim, which is that the bad life is worse than the good life, and that we should, in fact, universally work towards the good life, it doesn't seem to me that you'll accept the proposition that that's a universal claim.
No, it is. Well, should is irrelevant here. It's just the fact that there is the possibility of moving in this space. If you move in the wrong direction, if you move far enough, you'll like it less and less.
Well, why is should irrelevant?
Given the minds you have,
well,
right?
Well,
what if you had to accept moving in the wrong direction and experiencing less and less well-being in order to
get to a better place?
Maybe even just to survive. Suppose a population has to endure a generation and a half of misery in order to persist for another 100
ethically,
years.
that's a perfectly intelligible circumstance that people have had to face, and it's on my moral landscape, it's analogous to, I mean, we might be at one local maximum or some high point, but we're moving down a slope to get to yet some higher place, right? So some things may only be possible if we made some painful and net unpleasant sacrifice to get there.
That's for sure.
Yes, and so that can be rationally apprehended. There can be an argument for that. It could be we all have to go on a diet. Otherwise, we're going to die of this problem, right? We all have to stop eating whatever it is, wheat, right? It's a hard sacrifice for people who have to stop it, as you know. If that were just true, well, then there'd be an argument for it. There'd be evidence that would convince us. We would stop. We would feel the pain, and we would get whatever benefit that was on the other side of that sacrifice. But again, you don't have to. It's the utility. Again, to bring it back to stories, which is, as you know, not my emphasis, but it is yours. The utility of stories is not something I'm arguing against. I mean, there's no question that certain stories are incredibly compelling, and in our conversation with one another, the moment you begin to frame something in terms of a story, people become much more interested, right? Like if 90% of what we said together tonight were framed, each point we were making as a matter of philosophy or science were framed in, well, actually, yesterday I was walking down the street and I met this guy, who's a terrifying looking guy, and all of a sudden people become much more interested, right? And then that's not an accident. And that says something deep about us that we could understand in evolutionary terms, and we might in fact want to creatively leverage to be better people.
Yes.
And to have better conversations.
Definitely.
Yes. So
that's what I think.
There's nothing that I say in opposition to religious dogmatism and religious sectarianism that discounts that reality. And that's a psychological reality. It's a cultural reality, and I'm not against making the most of it. My basic claim, however, is that we never need to believe that one of our books may not have a human origin in order to do that effectively. You can be just as compelled by the example of somebody like Jesus or some more modern person who strikes you as a moral hero and deeply wise, without believing anything on insufficient evidence. And as you alluded to, purely fictional stories about superheroes can have immense effect on us, and that's something we could understand and also leverage. But again, that takes us out of the religion business, and that's all I've been arguing for.
So do you really believe that that the belief in the supernatural aspect of these stories never alters the calculus of what people should do? That the divine nature of a story about Jesus doesn't motivate people to do something that they might not have the courage to do otherwise? The belief that they might end up in heaven because their good work is going to be observed doesn't alter their behavior?
Well, yeah, I know it alters their behavior, but rather often for the bad.
Well,
no, I mean, this is what worries me about. I think there's a profound net negative that we are paying the price for every day by believing in paradise, right? A belief that this life it probably doesn't matter very much at all, because we get what we really want after we die is, forget about the evidentiary basis for that belief. It's ruinous for prioritizing what we should be prioritizing in this life. And
I agree with that, by the way.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yep. So, let me ask you this. I hear from you what might be a kind of confirmation bias, where I hear that, we've got a mixed bag. You've got supernatural claims. These supernatural claims, we all agree, have effects on the way people actually behave. And you're quite focused on the negative, and you tend to discount the positive, which might be an artifact of the fact that we're talking about the present, and therefore maybe something that's not well matched to these stories, or it might be from the idea that you have the sense that there is actually a bias, that these belief structures do and have always produced more harm than good.
And also my sense that the positive can be had without those structures. So if you're talking about the contemplative experience, like, is it possible to wake up tomorrow morning feeling like Meister Eckhart, right? Feeling like you're just inseparable from the pure capital B being that is consciousness, right? And there's no separate self there, right? A self-transcending union with everything you can perceive, right? I think that can be had without any kind of religious dogmatism. That's just a matter of paying close enough attention to the nature of consciousness. So the contemplative life is one baby in the bathwater we can save. The ethical life is another baby we can save. You don't have to presuppose anything on insufficient evidence to argue about what is right and wrong and good and evil in the 21st century. And that's,
so is it fair to call that a hypothesis, that not just for some people, but for everyone, the level of well-being can be enhanced through rational interaction with the questions that dictate what we do? Is that a hypothesis?
Well, that's a hypothesis. The one additional fact that makes that more or less moot is that on certain points, even if we felt that really believing the fiction was advantageous to people, depending on which fiction you're talking about, there's too much evidence against it. You can't decide to believe something for which you have no evidence simply because of the good effects, the good experience it will give you, or you imagine it will give you. I mean, that's why Pascal's wager never made any sense. I mean, you can't say, the only way you can believe something to be true, really true, not just metaphorically true, is to believe that if it weren't true, you wouldn't believe it. That you stand in some relationship to its truth such that that is the reason why you believe it. Now, you can't be telling yourself, I have no evidence for this thing, but I know life would be better if I believed it to be true, and so therefore I really believe it's true.
You don't think people do that all the time?
I don't think they do. I think they do things much more like we're talking, the metaphorical truth we're talking about. We act as if things are true without forming any strong propositional claim, and that's fine. That's fine. That has its own utility.